We continue now at the top of Daf Kufiyad Beis Amud Aleph and Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 112a. And the previous Amud, the Mishnah said that if the blood of a carbon chatas is received in one kos, in one cup, and first it's applied outside the Beis HaMikdash and then inside the Beis HaMikdash, or the reverse, it's first applied inside and then outside, in both cases the person would be liable for offering a carbon outside of the Beis HaMikdash. And the Gemara says, Bishlama b'chutz v'chazar v'nasan b'fnim. I understand if it's first applied outside and then applied inside. Shakulo roy lios b'fnim. It was all fit at the time that it was applied outside the Beis HaMikdash. It was all fit to be applied inside the Beis HaMikdash, which is what is necessary to be liable for offering a carbon b'chutz. Avol b'fnim v'helen b'chutz. But if he first offers the blood in the Beis HaMikdash, applies the blood in the Beis HaMikdash, and then he offers it outside the Beis HaMikdash, so shirayim ninu. So then it's really remainder. It's just leftover blood. And if it's leftover blood, why is there liability for that b'chutz? And the Gemara says, Hamani, who is the author of our Mishnah? Reb Nechemya. It's Reb Nechemya, the Amar, who says, Shiyore hadam shekrivan b'chutz chayev. We saw Reb Nechemya earlier. Reb Nechemya says the remnant blood, if it's offered outside the Beis HaMikdash, then the person is liable. The Gemara says, Reb Nechemya, but if it's Reb Nechemya, Ema Seifa, let's look at the end of the Mishnah. It says, Kibel dama b'shnei kosos. Let's say the blood is received in two separate cups. Nasan shneim b'fnim pater. If both are applied inside the Beis HaMikdash pater, we say exempt. That's obvious. Nothing is even done outside the Beis HaMikdash. Shneim b'chutz. If they're both applied outside the Beis HaMikdash, so then chayiv, then there'd be liability. Echad b'fnim v'echad b'chutz. If one cup is applied in the Beis HaMikdash and one outside the Beis HaMikdash, so then we say pater. Then he's exempt on what was applied outside of the Beis HaMikdash. And the Gemara asks, V'amar Reb Nechemya, but doesn't Reb Nechemya say, Shiyore hadam shekrivan b'chutz, that if you have remnant blood offered outside, chayiv, then chayiv. What's the difference that in this case it's two cups? Why does that make a difference? And the Gemara says to that, Seifa Ason l'Tanakama de Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon. The Seifa is going according to the Tanakama of Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon, the Amar, who says, Kos osa dichoy l'chaver. When you have two cups, one cup makes the other cup dichoy. It pushes it off, and in a situation of dichoy, there is no liability in terms of offering it outside of the Beis HaMikdash. And we will take a look at the Shinui Neschos for a slightly different girsa in the Gemara. The Shinui Neschos has Man Tana de Poligolea de Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon. Who's the Tana that argues on Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon, the Amar, and says Kos osa chavero dichoy, that one cup can make the other cup dichoy, can push it off? Reb Nechemya, it is Reb Nechemya. And Rashi seems to have that girsa. Rashi says Man Tana de Poligolea de Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon bePerak Kol Apsulin. Who is the Tana that argues on Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon in Perak Kol Apsulin? V'yomer, and says Kos osa chavero dichoy, that there's a concept of dichoy by the kos. The katani chatas shekibel dama biarba kosas, because it says if you have a chatas where the blood is received in four cups, v'nasan arba matanos me'echad mehem, and then four applications are given from one of those cups, hu levado nishbach liyasod, that is the only one where the rest of the blood is poured to the base of the mizbeach, v'hein nishbachin liyama, and the rest, they're going to be poured to the amma, to the stream that ran underneath of the Beis HaMikdash. Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon Amar Hasam kulon nishbachin liyasod, and Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon says over there that they're all poured to the yasod, to the base of the mizbeach, to kasavar kos echad osas chaveru shirayim, because he holds that one cup makes the other cup's shirayim, makes it remnant. But again, our Mishnah says that it's dichoy. And the Gemara said, Reb Nechemya, it's Reb Nechemya the Poligala, who argues the Amar Hacha. He says over here, kibel dama bekos echad, if the blood is received in one cup, nasan bifnim, and he applies the blood inside the mikdash, v'chazar v'nasan b'chutz, and then he goes ahead and applies it outside, so chayiv, then he's liable for offering outside the Beis HaMikdash, shirayim ninu, because then it has the status of shirayim, it's remnant blood. Ushiyore hadam shekriva b'chutz chayiv, and again, when you offer remnant blood outside, so there's a liability. V'heichad dekiblu b'shnei kosas, but where it's received in two cups, amar pater. So there he says pater. Alma kos sheni lav shirayim chashiv la. You see, according to Nechemya, the second cup is not shirayim, ella dichoy haya. Rather, it's dichoy lishboch liamas, poured into the stream. Hilkach la mechayev ala b'chutz. Therefore, there's no liability outside of the Beis HaMikdash. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Lamaha davar doma, what is it similar to? Again, the case where the blood is received in two cups. So we say that if they're both applied inside the mikdash, there's no liability. Both applied outside the mikdash, there is liability. If the first one is applied inside the mikdash, the second one outside, so then there's no liability. But if it's the reverse, the first is applied outside and then the second inside, so then there is liability for offering outside the Beis HaMikdash. And the one that's applied inside the mikdash will provide a kapara, will provide an atonement. And the Mishnah said, what is that comparable to? Lemafresh chatos v'yavda. Let's say somebody separates an animal for a carbon chatos and it gets lost. V'hifresh acheres tachteh. Then he separates another animal instead. V'achar kach nimtzas harishona, and then he finds the first. Now he has the two animals. So again, the Mishnah said a very similar set of halachas. If they're both brought inside the mikdash, so then pater, outside the mikdash chayiv. And again, if one is brought first inside and then the other one outside, there's no liability. If first you bring one outside and then the other one inside, so then there is liability. Essentially, a very similar set of halachas. And the Gemara asks, Lama hadavar doma lamali, what's the purpose of giving this Lama hadavar doma? Rashi says, Mai Lama hadavar doma, Lamai hilchas adaminu, for what practical halacha are we comparing? Umai gamar minan, what do we learn from this? And the Gemara says, Hamani, who is the author of the Mishnah? Rebbe, the author of the Mishnah is Rebbe. The Amar, who says, Avuda b'shas hafrasha, if it gets lost at the time of separation, mesa, then it dies. V'hachi kamar, and the Mishnah means to say as follows. Taima de'avda, the only reason this halacha is true is because the animal was lost. Ha'hifrish shtei chatos la'achrayis, but let's say he separated two animals for the carbon chatas as achrayis. In other words, he understood that maybe he's not going to be able to bring one of them, he wanted to have two, just in case, to make sure that he fulfilled his obligation. So then, then one of them from the outset is going to be considered to be an ola. And Rashi explains, Hamani Rebbe do Amar, who is the author of the Mishnah? It's Rebbe who says, Meseches Tmura, this is in Meseches Tmura, Avuda b'shas hafrasha, let's say the animal is lost at the time that the second animal was separated. That's our case in the Mishnah. Again, the case in our Mishnah is that one animal was separated, designated for a carbon chatas, it gets lost. When it's lost, now a second animal is designated for that carbon chatas, then the first one is found, and then let's say, for example, the second one is offered, so now the first one has a halacha of a chatas shekipru ba'aleh. It's a carbon chatas where the owner's already got an atonement, which is lamisa. That means that second animal is left to die, and since that animal is left to die, therefore, if one would offer that animal bachutz, there is no liability. And that's following Rebbe, that again, Rebbe says if it was lost at the time of hafrasha, mesa, we say that that animal is left to die, kechatas shekipru ba'aleh, following the halacha of a chatas, that the owner got an atonement. The kaimulon, because we've established the azla lamisa, that again, that animal is left to die. Afilu lo haisa rishona avuda b'shasha mischaper b'shniya, and that's even if the first one was not lost at the time of the kapara, meaning at the time that the second animal was actually used, was actually brought as a carbon, the first one was already found. Ella b'shas hafrasha was only lost at the time of the hafrasha, then they found that animal later. Umishahifrish zu tachteh, and again when they separated the second animal instead, nimsis, then it was found, kaimul ba, the halacha is dim nischaper biachas mehen, that if one of those animals is chosen for the kapara as the carbon, shniya mesa, the second is left to die. And Rashi continues and explains, V'hachi kamar tana de masnisin, and this is what the Tana of our Mishnah is saying, Taima de'avda, the reason why this halacha is true is because it was lost. Kilomar, what it means to say is, Zu shehufresha al yedei ibur chaverta, this one that was designated because the other one was lost, that is, it's only in that situation, Techi shochet achas mehen bachutz, that if one of them is slaughtered outside, achas shaker v'charverta, after the other one, the first one is offered, meaning one of the animals is first offered in the mikdash, and then the second one is offered bachutz, so then we say pater, then we say exempt. The dam yulakos dichoy, it's similar to the case of a cup which is pushed off, the case of the 2 cups of blood, where we say you apply from one cup the blood, so then the other one becomes dichoy. And why is that? Mishum decha Rebbe svirle, it's because the Tana of our Mishnah holds like Rebbe, the Amar Lamisa Azla, who says that in this case, the animal is left to die, and so therefore, again, since it's like a chatas shekipru ba'aleh, and it's left to die, therefore there's no liability in a case of bachutz. Aval, but, let's say originally he separated 2 animals, and he did that because he wanted to be sure that he would have an animal to fulfill his obligation. That should one become lost, he'll have a kapar with the other one. There, Rebbe moda bo. There, actually, even Rebbe admits the mischaper biachas mehen, that the halacha is you choose one of them as a kapara, v'hashniya tira, and then the second one is left to graze, and it develops a mum v'dameha la'olas kayetz hamizbech, and then you use the money for a carbonola in the summer because they wanted the mizbeach always to have carbonos on, and in the long days of the summer they would use olas kayetz hamizbeach, they would use animals for that purpose. V'chein l'rabbanan, and the same would be true according to the rabbanan ba'avuda b'shas hafrasha. In our case, let's say it would be lost at the time of hafrasha, like our case in the Mishnah, the islahu tira. They also hold in that case that it's left to graze. So in situations where the second animal is left to graze to develop a mum, so lo amrina, then we don't say dim shachta b'chutz l'shniya deniftar, that if the second one is slaughtered outside pater, there we don't say that. V'yafal gav de lechatchila lo kervehi gufa ola, even though lechatchila, that second animal, shouldn't itself be offered as an ola, ela demei, and rather it's the money that's used for an ola, but chayiv ole bachutz, but there would be liability if it would be offered outside the Beis HaMikdash. Di akrav l'dida gufa ola bifnim miskabel asi, because if you would take that second animal and offer it itself as an ola bifnim inside the mikdash, then it would be accepted, and therefore, again, since it would be accepted, if it's offered outside the Beis HaMikdash, there is liability. And the Gemara continues and says, Zuchud Rav Huna Amar Rav, this is like Rav Huna Amar Rav, the Amar Rav Huna Amar Rav, because Rav Huna says that Rav says, Asham shenitak l're'iyah, if you have an asham that's left to graze, to develop a blemish, you're supposed to be using the money for a carbon, but then v'shachtu stam, then the animal itself is slaughtered, kasher li'ol, it is kasher to be a carbon ola, and that's again like Rashi just said before, like Rashi said, in the case of a chatas, you can have a case like that as well. But the Gemara asks me, dummy, but can you really compare an asham to a chatas? Hasam asham zachar, v'ola zachar, over there, a carbon asham is a male animal, and an ola is a male animal, so it would make sense to say that in a case of an asham shenitak l're'iyah, that if it's brought as a carbon ola, it's going to be accepted. Aval chatas nekevahi, but a chatas is a nekeva, it's a female animal, and so therefore it doesn't make any sense to say that, even if you had a case of a chatas, which was nitak l're'iyah, which was not left to die, still if you brought it as a carbon, it shouldn't be an ola, because again, it's a female. And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Rav Chia miyustinya b'seir nasir. Rav Chia miyustinya says, we're talking about a chatas that is the seir, the he-goat of a nasi, the nasi is the king, and therefore that is a male chatas, and it's in that case that we would say, again, in a situation where it's nitak l're'iyah, if you did bring it as a carbon, it would be considered an acceptable carbon ola. And Rashi explains, Kid Rav Huna Amar Rav, Asham nitak l're'iyah, it's like Rav Huna Amar Rav, that if you have an Asham that is consigned to graze, it's left to graze and develop a blemish. Kagon, for example, Tmuras Asham, if you have a substitute animal of a carbon Asham, the Asham shemesu ba'olav, or you have a carbon Asham where the owner died, Onus chapru ba'acher, or let's say the owner got a kapar from another animal. The Kaim Alon, we've established a general rule, Kol shebechatos mesa, anytime you have a case where an animal that's a chatos would be left to die, be Asham roa, by carbon Asham it's left to graze. V'nimlach bebezin v'amru lo yira, and so the case over here is, let's say he consulted Bezin and they said it should be left to graze, v'shachtu stam, and then slaughtered it stam, so kasher liola, it's kasher as a carbon ola. And Rashi notes, v'dafka nitak, this is only if it was consigned to graze. Avalo nitak, but if it was not nitak l're'iyah, so then lo, so then we wouldn't say that it would be an ola. Kid amar b'parakama, like we say in the first parak of this Mesechet, who, the Gemara over there says from the pasuk, the word in the pasuk who, b'hava yaso yehe, then it stays in the same state as an asham, it would not be an ola. And then the Gemara said, Midami masnisin l'Rav Huna, can you compare our Mishnah to Rav Huna? L'chiyuve achatas shniya b'chutz, to say there's liability on the second chatas outside, may high timer for this reason. Halo chazia hi gufa la'ola klal, d'hanekeva, you can't say that the animal is fit to be an ola at all, because it's a female animal. And then the Gemara said, Miyustinya makom, that's the name of a place, and the Gemara ultimately answered, Besir nasi, we're talking about the higot of the nasi, of the king, shehifrish shnayim la'achrayas, that he separated two, again, to take responsibility to make sure that he would bring the carbon. The hasam zachar, who that over there, it is a male animal, and therefore, since it is a male animal, it could be brought as an ola. Hadron Allah hashochid v'hamala, we will return to you, parak hashochid v'hamala. This is the end of the 13th parak of Meseches Zevachim. If you're enjoying these videos and this channel, please like, share, and subscribe, and take a look at the description box below to see how you can support this channel. And we will now begin the 14th parak of Meseches Zevachim. And the parak begins with the Mishnah, Paras Chatas, the Para Aduma, Shesarfa Chutz Migita, if it's burned outside of its pit. There was a designated pit that it was supposed to be burned in by the Harazesim, let's say it was burned outside of that area. V'chein Soyer HaMishtaleach, and also the he-goat that is sent away La'azazel on Yom Kippur, Shehikriv B'chutz, let's say it's offered outside the Beis HaMikdash. In both of those cases, Potter, he's exempt. There's no liability there for offering outside the Beis HaMikdash. Shenemar, as the Pasuk says, V'al Pesach ol Moed lo hevio, it says he didn't bring it to the entrance of the Ol Moed. But kol she'ein roi lavo el Pesach Ol Moed, anything that's not fit to come to the Pesach Ol Moed, the Para Aduma, for example, is not brought as a carbon. The Sar Mishtalech is not brought as a carbon, so that's ein roi lavo el Pesach Ol Moed, so ein chayav in olav. Then there is no liability for offering it bachutz. And the Mishnah continues, Haroveya v'hanirba, animals that are involved in bestiality, or they're the objects of bestiality, v'hamuksa v'hanevad, if it's designated for avodah zarah, worshipped as avodah zarah, v'hamechir, and an animal that's exchanged with a dog, v'ha'esnan, an animal that's used as payment to a prostitute, v'hakilayim, an animal that's born from diverse species, v'hatrefa, an animal that's a trefa, it has a mortal wound, it'll die within 12 months, v'yotze dofen, an animal that was born by cesarean section. In all of those cases, she'ekrivan b'achutz, if those animals are offered outside the Beis HaMikdash Pater, the individual is exempt. Shenemar, as it says, Lifnei Mishkan Hashem, it has to be something that is fit Lifnei Mishkan Hashem. Kol she'in roi lavu Lifnei Mishkan Hashem, if it's not fit to come before the Mishkan Hashem, ein chayav in all of them, there's no liability. All of these animals are disqualified, and therefore there's no liability b'achutz. And the Mishnah continues, Bali Mumin, when it comes to animals with blemishes, Bain Bali Mumin Kavuan, whether they are permanent blemishes, Bain whether, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Kuf Yud Beis Amid Beis.